Hello and welcome back to another video about the units of Company of Heroes 2, in which I'm going to talk about their historical background and tell you something about every vehicle which is being used by the Red Army. I'll talk about some specifics and tell you what's realistic and what's not so realistic about the unit in Company of Heroes. And I talked about the infantry of the Red Army last time, so now it's time for the vehicles. And we start out with the M3 A1 scout car. As you can hear, it says a white scout car ready for orders, and it's the white scout car is the nickname of this one because it was produced by the White Motor Company. This all sounds very American because it's an American vehicle, and it was produced after a series of tests with scout cars in the United States, and after having built the M1 and the M2 scout car, they went for mass production with the M3. Actually, this is the M3A1, so that means by the American conventions of naming the Model 3 Alteration 1 light scout car, and this one is being mass produced after the M3 was being pulled because it was not what they actually wanted in the scout car, so they made this alteration. It has American weaponry on it, 50 cal machine gun, and you can see it has a Russian crew, and they are wearing the typical headgear for Russian vehicle drivers and gunners. It's called the Shlemofon. Before the war, these caps or helmets, they were made of leather, but that became too expensive, so Stavka decided that they had to be made of cloth. So you can see khaki ones, as in this scout car here, and there are also black and gray ones. And there were over 20,000 sorry, there were over 20,000 scout cars built, and about 3,300 of them were sent to the Soviet Union as a Lend-Lease vehicle. As you can see, there is some Soviet writing on the vehicle here, and this is because, of course, it's Russian, and it says over here, it says Pobeda, which means victory, and over here it says, I don't really speak Russian, so I had this translated. And this here says Bey Fashistov, which means beat the fascists. And the fascists, they are the Germans, of course. And even if there's a distinction between fascists and National Socialists, for the Russians they were all the same. And even after the war, the communists actually kept calling Westerners fascists, even though they were not all fascists anymore by then. And by not all, I mean that it was pretty exceptional after World War II for being a fascist, for obvious reasons. So, and this brings us to our next vehicle, which is also a Lend-Lease vehicle. This is the M5 Halftrack, and if you have seen my video on American vehicles, you might have noticed that this vehicle was actually not used by the American Army. So it's unrealistic in Company of Heroes 2 when it comes to the USF, but it's pretty realistic when it comes to the Soviet Army. Again, like with the scout car, it has the hammer and sickle symbol on it, so you can see that it's Russian now. It has the same writing on the side, and this one here is a bit more elaborate. It doesn't only say victory, but it says victory will be ours. Pobeda budet za nami. And that's that's of course a bit of propaganda and a bit of gaining some self-confidence. But this M5, which can be upgraded with 4 50 cal machine guns, and then it will say Krautmower, and Kraut was the regular nickname, the English nickname for Germans, because all Germans of course were eating sauerkraut, which is a vegetable. So when you upgrade it with this, the 50 cal is being replaced, and you can hear the Krautmower being mentioned here, and now it has it's a ZSU M17 MGMC, which is also the realistic name of the Lend-Lease Halftracks with this weapon on the back. So, and this brings us to our next vehicle, which is the Katyusha. And the Katyusha is a very specific weapon, because it's actually what makes it a weapon is this rocket rack on the back. The rocket rack on the back is actually the M13 rocket launcher. This vehicle is of course called BM13, and BM stands for, it means combat vehicle, and the abbreviation is Bojevaja Machina, so that makes BM. And then the 13 is because of the rocket system on the back, the BM13 or the M13 launcher. Over 10,000 of these were built, so it's a pretty common vehicle, and that's because it was pretty cheap to produce, because actually you only have to build the weapon, the rocket launcher thing, because then it's mounted on different types of trucks. Like this truck here, this is a ZIS truck, probably a ZIS 6, which is the most common truck on which it was built, that was Soviet produced, but it was also mounted on Lend-Lease Studebaker trucks from America. Katyusha is a pretty well-known nickname, because when it was and where it comes from is when it was produced, when they started to make this weapon, it was very secret of course, and they had several code names, and they were invented in Voronezh. And the Comintern factory, Comintern was of course the international communist organization, whose goal was to plant communism in every country, and therefore had different groups in various countries promoting communism. And the Comintern factory had the letter K as a mark for its products. So this truck with the rocket launcher was also marked K. Then the soldiers, they came up with Katyusha, because Katyusha was a very popular wartime song, and they took the name from that song and just stuck it to this vehicle. For the Germans, this one was called Stalin's organ, because this rocket thing resembles organ's pipes, and also because of the sound, because if we make it fire, we're going to do it right now.
Orders received.
So when we make it fire, it also has a very distinctive sound, which apparently resembled organ music. I don't know if the Germans listen to organ music very often, but because it doesn't really sound similar to me. But it was a very terrifying sound for most of the soldiers, and it had a psychological effect similar to the one that was made by Stuka sirens. When the truck was firing, you saw that the windows were closed up, and that's because of the crew, which had to be protected against the exhaust fumes of the rockets, of course. Because the design of the rocket racks was very simple, it could be mounted on various vehicles, and therefore the vehicles were put together in various units, and it was not a problem if the trucks were not the same. And usually a battery consisted of 4 BM13 launchers, and they could fire a salvo in 7 to 10 seconds that delivered a lot of high explosives over a large impact zone, and that was almost equal to about 70 conventional artillery guns. So after they had fired, the crew would then move the trucks to a different location, so counter battery was almost impossible. So this weapon was pretty common at the Russian front. It was not really ready when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Only 40 launchers had been built by then, but the Katyusha had such an impressive record of effectiveness that it quickly became very well known by not only the soldiers but also by the officials of the Red Army. By the end of 1942, over 3,000 of them had been produced, and they also tried to mount it on the chassis of KV-1 tanks, but they found out that they could use the KV-1 chassis for better purposes, so they abandoned that option. The Germans also copied this type of weapon, and they made some rocket launchers themselves, for example the Nebelwerfer. And until the Nebelwerfer hit the field, the rocket launchers were in special units under guards under control of the NKVD troops. NKVD, of course, being the secret service of the Soviet Union, controlling every possibly subversive elements in the Soviet Union, trying to be a fifth column or something, or destroying the Soviet state from inside. A noticeable event which made the Katyusha famous was in the Battle of Orsha. There was a battery of 7 rocket launchers destroying a concentration of German troops with tanks, armored vehicles and trucks, and the German army was scared in such a way that they immediately abandoned the town of Orsha, and that meant that the Russians could retake the town without having to fight at close quarters. So later in the war, the Katyushas were attached to heavy guards mortar battalions, or they were formed into heavy guards mortar battalions and then attached to guard armies. So that brings us to the self-propelled guns.
Su-76, go ahead.
We have a Su-76 right here, and actually this is not an Su-76 as you can see in the description, but it's an Su-76M. This is the case because only 360 Su-76 were built, and of the Su-76M, almost 14,000 were built. Why is that? Well, because of the fact that they were produced at first with two engines, one on the left side and one on the right side, and the engine on the left side would then drive the left track, and the engine on the right side would drive the right track, which made it totally impractical for the driver to stay steady and drive in a straight line. So the Su-76M was produced in which the engines were both put on the right side, which you can see here by the exhaust pipes, which are both on the right side. The Su-76 was a self-propelled gun. It had the chassis of the T-70, a light tank, of which I will talk about later. And the chassis of the T-70 was widened and elongated and extended, and then it carried a ZIS-3 76mm gun, which you can see here. I talked about this ZIS in the infantry video, and like the ZIS in infantry roles, the ZIS on the Su-76 can do a barrage, which we can see here. So you can see that the loader is putting in the shell and the gun is elevated, and the gun could elevate to such a height that it could cover a distance of 17 kilometers. The Su-76 was pretty popular with the crews that drove it, and they really liked how it was mobile, and that the gun was also able to be used in direct fire confrontations. And the open top, as you might see, it left the crew pretty vulnerable, but it had also an advantage, because in urban combat the crew of the AFV could really work together with the surrounding infantry very well, because they could just shout to each other if that was or make gestures, because they could see each other. That was a lot more useful than when it would have been closed up. Of course, a soldier which would be at the second or third floor of a building could lob in grenades into this compartment, and that would be super vulnerable. They would be super vulnerable to those. But it also saved the crew's lives in the case of a hit by a Panzerfaust, because a Panzerfaust hit would mean a lot of concussion in a closed compartment, and then the pressure would probably kill them. So this made the open top a lot better for the crews of the Su-76. The Su-76 was produced in the beginning of the war, and in the first half, and it was produced in the second half of the war. They started production in 1942, and they continued production until the end of the war in 1945. Even though that the bigger German tanks were coming on the field, the Su-76 was not totally without any chance against the bigger German heavies like the Panther tank. It could knock out the Panther tank with a flank shot, but the crews were trained to attack bigger like Tiger tanks, bigger tanks only from the rear if possible. So they had to put up ambushes, and otherwise they should aim for the tracks or the barrels of the big Tigers, because then they could maybe disable a track and make the tank immobile. It was a fast vehicle, it had a low profile, and the noise was limited, so the enemy could be snuck up on, and therefore they used the Su-76 as an ambush vehicle pretty regularly. Okay, so this brings us to the next self-propelled gun. Oh, by the way, the SU stands for Samochodnaya Ustanovka, which means self-propelled gun. And just to finish this one really completely, you can also see the graffiti here. Again, the Pobeda bude za nami, the victory will be ours. And also this one here, za rodinu, for the motherland. On the backside we have Peret, which means forward, and on this side we have a star symbol, which is used in a lot of Soviet vehicles. Okay, this brings us to the next self-propelled gun, which also has the same graffiti as we have seen several times now. This is the Su-85. The Su-85 was produced because the heavier tanks were coming on the field, and the 76mm guns could not penetrate the bigger tanks like the new versions of the Panzer IV so easily. So the Su-85 was designed, and the production started in 1943, but they were only produced for about a year. They built only 2,000 of them, which makes this actually a pretty rare vehicle, and therefore this is not as realistic as most other Soviet vehicles in Company of Heroes 2. As you can see here, the hull is totally closed. The fuel tanks are here on the back side, and the gun is the 85mm D5T gun. When the Soviet Union wanted a new self-propelled gun, they modified the earlier produced Su-122, and they were trying to make it so that they could penetrate the Tiger. This gun could penetrate a Tiger 1 from about 1,000 meters. Because of the low profile and the mobility, it was a pretty good tank hunter, but it became obsolete after the bigger tanks of the Germans came in into the fights. And after the war was over, they totally withdrew the Su-85 from Soviet service. But the larger German tanks, like the Panther and the Armor, the Tigers, they were only penetrated in certain cases. So even though it could penetrate at 1,000 meters, it was not the best way to fight German tanks. So Su-85 production stopped already after about a year, to make way for bigger tank destroyers, which we will see next. First we'll see this ability here. This is the commander hatch. In the first Su-85 versions, this he actually had some sort of an iron bubble in which he could sit, but it turned out that it was better for the profile to remove it, and so they came up with this variant. So the Soviets actually wanted bigger guns, so they made one.
Yes.
It's this one, the ISU-152 heavy assault gun. This one is the previous one, the Su-85, was built on the T34 chassis, and when the ISU-152 was produced at first, it was mounted on KV-1 chassis, but later they switched to the more modern IS-2 chassis or IS-1 chassis, because they didn't differ so much in the beginning. And this was sporting a 152mm gun, which you can see here. It was a gun howitzer, and actually this is the same gun as the ML20 howitzer that I talked about in the previous video. Because of the switch from the T34 chassis to the IS-1 chassis, the name also changed, because when they started production it was called the SU-152, and to designate the difference between the two types of chassis, they made it into the ISU-152. The ISU-152 had large shells. The shells were slow firing, but they had such a big power that when they hit a tank, then it would totally blow off the turret. For example, a Tiger 1, it would be disabled by a direct hit. The tank itself would not be penetrated, but well, that's not really necessary if you blow off the turret entirely, of course. Also, the crew inside the tank, it would not get the shell in their crew department, but the splintering inside the tank would be enormous because of the huge blast of the explosion. It would mean that the inside of the crew department would the metal would be chipped, and pieces of metal would fly through the compartment, wounding or killing the crew. In Company of Heroes 2, this gun is classified as a heavy assault gun, and that was also one of the roles it had in real life. It was a pretty good heavy assault gun in urban combat. It fought in the streets of Berlin, for example. There are pretty well-known pictures of the Battle of Berlin with the ISU-152 on them. Because this one had a closed crew department, it had pretty good protection against AT guns, and the front plate protection was 152 millimeters thick, which is actually quite funny because it was also called the ISU-152, of course. Okay, so when they were driving into towns, they would be a bit behind the smaller tanks, and then they would open fire on fortifications, preferably, because the shells, which weighed about 43 kilos each, they would totally destroy bunkers or something like that, other fortified positions. In urban combat, they could of course easily be hit by Panzerfausts, especially on these parts here. You can see this is the engine deck, and that's usually the weakest point of a tank, and a Panzerfaust could easily penetrate the upper armor there because it was much thinner than the front plates, of course. In the later parts of the war, they got some infantry squads attached to them, and the infantry squads would include a specialist sniper, a bunch of guys with Pepeshka 41s and sometimes a flamethrower, like the ROX 3 that I showed in the previous video. That is the heavy assault gun part of the ISU-152. It was also used as a heavy tank destroyer, and by blasting off the turrets of the big cats, the bigger German tanks were also were all named after animals, as you might know, especially if you saw the Wehrmacht video. The Panther, the Tiger, the King Tiger, the Elephant, they were all killed by Su-152s at one point, which made this vehicle have the nickname Zvero Boy, which means beast killer. Especially after the Battle of Kursk, this vehicle was used as an anti-tank vehicle, but because it was not really a tank destroyer, they were put in units together with some specialized units like the Su-100. Then the third role it had was heavy self-propelled artillery, and then it would be in the rear lines of the front, and it would just lob the huge shells over a large distance, and then you would not want to be on the receiving end of those. In game, this one can switch between high explosive, and it can also have concrete piercing round, which is symbolic for its role of destroying fortifications. And if you load the high explosive, then it's against infantry, of course, and then you can, if you want to switch back, you can load armor piercing rounds, which the ISU-152 used in the direct tank combat. It can be upgraded with a Dushka. You can see the Dushka right here. And the Dushka on the ISU-152 was especially meant for an anti-aircraft role. Unfortunately, you can't see that in Company of Heroes 2 because the AA Dushka had some circular sights on the right side for the gunner to aim at bypassing planes. Okay, so this concludes the part about self-propelled guns. Let's go to the tanks, and we start with the smallest one in game, which is called the T70. This is the T70. The T70 has a very unlogical name, because later we will talk about the T34. But even though the number 70 is a lot higher, it doesn't mean that it was only produced after the war, of course. This is because the Soviet Union had a system of naming vehicles, and they adopted it in 1929, and they started to make a document with the numbers of the vehicles in it, and after a while they just changed the way they were documenting the vehicles. They would make numbers a bit more, they wanted them to look nice. So by 1940 the tanks get round numbers like T40, T50, T60, and therefore also T70. They appear around this time, and then that means that there's no other explanation than just it's the successor of the T60, and it doesn't have anything to do with caliber or a year of production. But the T70 was a light scout tank. Over 8,000 of them were built, and it had a small 45mm main gun and also a DT machine gun as a coaxial. Light tanks were actually already considered inadequate by 1942. The earlier tanks in the Red Army, the T-26 for example, they were cavalry tanks. They had a lot of speed and only light armor. But those tanks were totally outclassed by the T-34 that I will talk about later. But then they needed some scout vehicle which was faster than the T-34 and also which could defend itself a bit better than those cavalry tanks. So the T-70 was taken into production in March 1942, and the chassis of the T-70 was later used for the Su-76 as we've seen before. In game this is a totally infantry killer, but in reality this was preferably not used in combat. It was preferably used as a scout, which also is portrayed in game by the recon mode, which puts out the officer out of the one-man turret. Actually this T-70 has a two-man turret, but the commander now sticks out with his binoculars to make to spot for artillery and to recon enemy positions. And well, the T-70 didn't fight a lot, but when they fought, they sometimes were overly successful, a lot more successful than you would expect from such a light tank. For example, there was this T-70 from the 3rd Guards Tank Army, and they saw a column of tanks approaching from the Germans. They took an ambush position, they were in the bushes, and when the tanks came by, the T-70 opened fire with some special ammunition, APCR, and they set fire to one Panther and immobilized a second Panther, which is probably the most spectacular feat of a T-70 in the war. So this one was produced because the light tanks were being made obsolete, and they were made obsolete by the most famous tank of the Russians in the war ever, and that is the T-34. This is the T-34. T was the designation for tanks. I forgot to tell that by the when I talked about the T-70, but T stands for tank, and the T-34 was made by the Soviets and they introduced it in 1940. This is one of the most successful tanks designs in the Second World War. The Germans called it, there was a German general, von Kleist, he called it the finest tank in the world. Heinz Guderian, the famous German tank commander, said that the T-34 was the best tank he had ever seen, and he actually suggested that the Germans would make an exact copy of the T-34 in order to be successful. The T-34 is also the most numerous tank built in the Second World War, and it was the second most numerous built ever. Only the successor, the T50 series, they were, and there have been made more of those, but the T-34, there were over 84,000 built of these, and you can split the T-34 in two categories. There's the 76mm T-34, that's this one. Actually, the way it's described here is the German designation. but because the Russians they called it T34 model and then the year, and the one that we see here is the T34 model 1941. And of this variation, I told you that there were 84,000 built, and of those 84,000, 35,000 were of this type. Well, what was so revolutionary about this tank design? There were several advantages over German tanks that were present in the T34. First, the tracks. They were a lot wider than most German tanks. Only later in the war, when the Germans are producing new tanks to fight on the Eastern Front, they start to introduce wider tracks for their tanks as well. Most influential is the sloped armor. Because the armor is sloped in this way, the thickness of the armor is theoretically increased. It's not literally increased, of course, but because shells are usually shot from the front, they have a much bigger chance to bounce like this. And this diminishes the chances of penetration, and that's a big plus, of course. So the T34 was a revolutionary design. It was also very simple. It could be mass produced easily, and the production was very fast. It was so fast that even they produced so many of them. Not all of them survived the war. About 45,000 T-34s were lost in the war, and this type of tank is the one that suffered the most tank losses of all time. When they were thinking about this design, they only had the T-26 tank in service and the KV-1. The T-26 was an infantry tank. It was slow. It had to keep pace with the infantry, and then in the late 30s they wanted to have a new tank, and they started developing various new types of tanks. A heavy one that became the KV-1, I'll talk about that one later, and they started to produce medium tanks, and they fought with these medium tanks against the Japanese, for example in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. In these battles they found out that the tanks were pretty vulnerable against Molotov cocktails, for example. So they improved the welds, because it was welded with poor quality, so there were seams through which the liquid fire could drip inside the crew department. So they were improving that, and they were doing field trials at Kubinka in 1939, and then the heaviest version that they came up with, it was called the A32, and they put the L11 76.2 mm gun on it, and they approved it for production as the T34. Sorry about that. So the T34, it had a bad start because the KV-1 tank factory was putting pressure on several guys in Stavka and in the Politburo, and because of conservatism they almost cancelled the production of the T-34, but also some high-ranking officers that were in the Red Army, they had been imprisoned because they were promoting tank warfare blitzkrieg style. But because the Red Army had performed so poorly against the Finns in the Winter War of 1939-1940, they needed to change something about their tank doctrine, and they also saw how effective the German tanks were in the Battle of France. So they came back on their previous stance on tank warfare. They released Tukhachevsky, the guy who said that they should make designated armored units, and they started producing the T34 in big numbers now. Okay, so the first T34s, they had a pretty bad communication in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. One of the advantages of the Germans over the Russians was the fact that they could communicate by radio. The Russian tankists didn't have that, and they had to sometimes, well, there's a story that they had to communicate by flag signals. Not entirely true if that's not entirely sure if that's true. It's a pretty spectacular story, but it meant that the communication between the T-34s was pretty bad. But even if the Germans took out T-34s by the hundreds, then it didn't mean that the Soviet Union was beaten, because the factories producing these tanks, they were working double shifts throughout the period of the Red Army withdrawing. They produced 40% of all T-34s during the year of September 1941 to September 1942, and this was a feat made by the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory in Stalingrad. Of course, this factory became a prime target of the Wehrmacht when they were surrounding Stalingrad, and some stories tell about the T-34 driven out of the factory by the workers that just made them unpainted with very crude engineering, and this meant that the T-34s were crewed by inexperienced people. Sometimes in Company of Heroes 2 you can hear female crew members. I couldn't find anything about female tank crews. Female snipers were obviously pretty famous. There were also some female infantry units and even some infantry scout units, as far as I recall, but I couldn't find anything about female tank crews. So if you know something about Soviet female tank crews, please post in the comments. Later the T-34 was improved, and the average production in 1943 was about 1,300 per month. So the T-34 was fighting alongside KV tanks in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. It was a fast tank. The armor was sloped, and it was very successful against the Panzers III and the Stug 2, Stug 1 and Stug 3 E, which was being used by the Wehrmacht. When encountering Stugs, the T-34 crew was trained to not fire at the Stug from the front. They had to surround it and try to fire at it from the rear, which was very well possible because of the speed of the T-34 and the fact that the Stug doesn't have a turret, of course. So to battle against the T-34, the Germans were forced to use heavier guns like artillery guns and bigger AT guns. So the Pak-40, which was already in production, of course, by the time that Operation Barbarossa started, had its production upped. so they could fight against the T34. A pretty well-known story is that the Tiger was a response to the T34. Actually, not really true, because the Tiger was already in design stages when the Germans had not seen any T34 yet. So that's some weird flow of history right there. Later, the T34 was upgunned, and it would become the T34-85, which we can see right here. This also had various models, and like the T34 76, which was the model 1941, this also had various variations, of course. I wanted to say iterations, but it's of course a variation. The T34-85 had the same gun as the Su-85, so the D5T 85mm, and that was needed because of the bigger tanks of the Germans coming on the field. This one is the T34-85. Is the variation is not the first iteration. It's but it's the second one. After the D5T had been used on some of the T34-85s, they got a new gun, the ZIS S53, and that proved to be a better gun. So most of the T34s were most of the T34-85s were were built with that gun. It's the model 1944, produced from March 1944 through to the end of that year. It's the longer one, the longer production run of the two. So the T34-85 was built as a response to the bigger German tanks like the Panther, and even though the 85mm gun was not 100% sure to penetrate, it had a much bigger chance, of course, of doing some damage than the 76mm gun of the previous version of the T34. What remained a success factor of the T34 was the speed, and it had better armor even than the Panzer IV. But it was also still a very cheap tank to produce, so it was a lot more cost effective than the heavier German tanks. So while the Germans were trying to make bigger and heavier tanks with bigger guns and larger engines, the Soviets just picked this design and produced thousands of them. So that's the difference between the Germans and the Soviets in a nutshell. Sorry for the coughing, I'm having a bit of a cold. Well, this brings us to the next Soviet tank. Or no, we're first going to have to look at the one other Lend-Lease vehicle. This is the Sherman Lend-Lease. It's designated M4C in Company of Heroes 2. Actually, in reality, it was the M4A2, so Model 4 Alteration 2. This was the Lend-Lease tank for the Soviets, and they received several thousand of them, but they didn't use them that much. because I think it's because they actually did not really need them after they were making the T34 in such big numbers. So upgradable by an MG, of course the 50 cal. In reality, the Germans would the Soviets would put their own machine guns on top of Lend-Lease vehicles by preference. But this Sherman also fought on the steppes of the Soviet Union, and therefore it's present on in Company of Heroes. Some other Lend-Lease tanks are missing, most notably the Churchill, which was present at the Battle of Kursk, for example, but also Valentines and other British and American tanks were used by the Red Army in the fight against the Germans. Okay, so now we're going to the classic heavy tank of the Red Army, the KV-1. KV stands for Kliment Voroshilov, which you can see here, right here, and he was a commissar of warfare when the war broke out. And when with war I mean the war against Germany, because the war against Finland and the war against Japan, they were of course before the Second World War. This tank also has they were present in the opening stages of Barbarossa. It was the one of the most famous series of Soviet heavy tanks, and the KV series were famous because of their heavy armor protection, and the stories are that the Germans encountered these KV tanks and they were shooting at them and then nothing happened, and they were shocked by seeing that nothing actually happened to the tank itself. Well, even though they could not penetrate the armor of the KV tank, they could still hurt the crew, especially with fast-firing light weaponry, for example scout cars. They could just massively shoot at the turret, and then inside the metal compartment of the turret the sound would become super loud, and it would make the ears of the crew bleed, and they would probably either become deaf or they would abandon the tank. So there were ways to shoot at the tank and disable it, but not by penetrating the armor, and it took a while before the Germans had found out this trick. Because it was so big, they called it the Russischer Koloss, and this is a much rarer vehicle than the T34. About 5,000 of these were built. It was much heavier than the T34 because this one, it weighed 45 tons, and the T35 was much lighter because the T34 weighed 26 tons, which is not half, but close to half of the KV. The thing that made the KV not so successful is the 76mm gun, because it could not really penetrate anything bigger than the Panzer IV-D, and all other tanks were of course vulnerable to the 76.2mm, and the interesting stuff about the KV series is that the factory of the KV tanks was in competition with the T34 factories. So they were trying to be, they were both trying to become the mainstay of the Red Army, and of course in hindsight we can say that the KV tanks did not succeed. So trying to keep up with the T34, they also made a variation of the KV-1, which is called the KV-1S, and S stands for the Russian word for speed, because they tried to abandon some of the armament so they could make the tank a bit more speedy, but it failed, and it didn't gain that much speed, so that was a failed experiment right there. The KV had a nice role as an infantry tank because it was not so fast and it was heavily armored, so it could protect infantry, but because actually it became obsolete pretty quickly, but because the Germans were so scared of it in the beginning of the war, Stavka decided that they would continue to build KV-1s even though they were becoming obsolete. Or maybe, not sure about this, but maybe the political guys that were having ties with the KV production sites were putting up their increasing the pressure so that the KV was continued to be produced even though it was not really needed anymore. Okay, so the KV also had variations, and here we can see the KV-2 heavy assault tank. This one has an M10 152mm howitzer, which is a cruder howitzer than the one which was present in the ISU 152. The KV-2 was produced at the same time as the KV-1. It was a lot slower than the KV-1 because of this huge turret that you can see here. Iconic thing. If you would see it over the horizon as a German, it would scare you pretty much because the armor of the KV-2 was as impenetrable as the armor of the KV-1. Here you can see a commissar or a political officer, but I'm pretty sure they wanted to portray a tank commander here. This one has the firing positions ability, which makes the commander disappear inside the tank and the tank becoming immobile. The KV-2 was not really effective, and of the KV-2 there were a lot less built than the KV-1, because and that was because of this ineffectiveness. The KV-2 only a few hundred were built, and to be precise, there were 334 KV-2s produced. Super heavy, 52 tons, and not a big success on the battlefield. There was also a flamethrower variant of the KV. This is actually just a KV-1 with a flamethrower projector. And if we make it attack, you can see it in action. So, and this one could be in game. It can be replaced by a vehicle, a light vehicle, 45mm main gun, which is capable of destroying light vehicles but not tanks. The flamethrower is, of course, a terror weapon. When KV-8s would approach an enemy position, the Germans would most likely flee it, because burning to death is one of the most horrible deaths you can die. And if you were in a bunker and you saw the flames coming over the horizon, like in an elevated position, you are behind your MG in a concrete bunker, and you can see over the edge of the hill, over the crest of the hill, the flames are being launched into the air, and you hear the sound of the engine of the KV. Then most infantry would just take off and leave the battlefield. So a terror weapon in a tank instead of in a plane, which brings us to our last tank, which is here. the IS-2. The IS-2 is the IS means Josef Stalin, and you might notice that it's called IS-2, and that also means that there was an IS-1, but the IS-1 was actually just a prototype, and the IS-2 is the new name for the same tank. So actually IS-1 turned into the IS-2. This one was built in the second half of the war. Production started in 1943. There were almost 4,000 of them were made, so they were more numerous than the KV tanks. The KV2 and the KV8. The KV1 had similar numbers in total. This one also has DT coaxial machine guns, and it can be upgraded with a Katyusha anti-air machine gun. The production of this was started after the Soviets captured a Tiger 1. They wanted to make a heavy tank which was similar to the Tiger 1, and they started to design a secret project which was called Object 237. This resulted in a tank called the KV-85, because this tank was produced by the same factories that were producing the KV-1, the KV-2 and the other KV tanks, and they were of course keeping the development up, and the Object 237 prototype was produced as the IS-85 at first. So the IS-85 turned into the IS-1 because the IS-122 was introduced to the battlefield, and then IS-85, because it was a tank, it should be clear that it was not a self-propelled gun just like the IS-122. And then later the IS-1 was renamed into the IS-2 for security purposes. The gun was the A19 120mm gun, and it could fire AP and HE shells, and just like with the ISU-152, it was actually enough to just throw a 122mm high explosive shell against the tank to disable it. It could also blow off turrets of tanks. It could disable tracks, of course, and the armor was that big that a Panther had to close to 600 meters to guarantee penetration of the frontal armor. The IS-2 itself could penetrate the Panther at ranges of about 1,000 meters. So they could open fire at the Panthers, and the Panthers could not shoot back effectively. This was, of course, an advantage in tank-to-tank combat. Usually the IS-2 was used in fights against infantry, and of course also against fortified positions, just like I was telling you about when I was talking about the ISU-152. So the shock and the explosion of the shell was often enough to knock out enemy heavy tanks. In urban combat, the IS-2 fared well because it was the armor was pretty impenetrable, and it was very famous for its performance in the battle, in the later battles of the war. Famous battle, of course, is the Battle of Ogleduf, which is actually portrayed in a map of the mod for Gunnob 2, which I play regularly, and you can see videos of those in my channel. The IS-2 tanks that were fighting at Ogledouf were destroying the then new King Tigers of the German army. It was in August 1944, and this was one of the biggest feats of IS-2s in the war ever. So this concludes our story about the tanks. Then we have one more vehicle to go, and that's a commander ability. So let's see how we get the commander abilities here. I want an Ilyushin bombing strike. Okay. Okay, the Ilyushin bombing strike is coming here.
Ilyushin IL-2 bomb strike imminent.
Ilyushin IL-2 attacking.
And there it is, the Ilyushin. And the Ilyushin, the IL-2, the Ilyushin Sturmovik, is the most common close air support vehicle of the Red Army in the Second World War. Actually, if you choose commander ability with the Ilyushin, it has the PTAB anti-tank bombing run, which is the PTAB is the abbreviation for anti-tank bombing strike, and there's also a scout option, but they are all performed by the Ilyushin. It's actually pretty similar to the Wehrmacht, which has scout abilities, anti-infantry abilities, all performed by the same Stuka model. The Ilyushin is famous because of its armament. The pilot was very much protected. He had a steel plate behind his back, and therefore he could not be shot down so easily when the plane was attacked from the ground. The Ilyushin could be equipped with bombs, like we saw before. It could also be equipped with rockets, a bit similar to the Typhoon from the British Army, or the Thunderbolt from the American Army. And of course it had machine guns to strafe targets on the ground. In the war itself, it played a large role in big battles like the Battle of Kursk, and it was famous for its kills on the ground mostly. They also had some anti-air engagements, so they were shooting down other planes, but usually they took out targets on the ground, like with the PTAB, like I was describing before, the Protivotankovaya Avia Bomba, and with the RS-82 rockets, and that were similar to the rockets of the Typhoon. Yeah, Kursk is by far its most famous battle, but it also took part in the war against Finland. It took part in the fight out of the Soviet Union on the Leningrad front and the Vistula front. The crew was the pilot, and there was also a rear gunner. The rear gunner was to scare off enemy planes, of course, and in the meantime we can take another look at this big aircraft flying over the vehicles that were selected for this video. And in these models you can see the machine guns. These Ilyushins are not equipped with the rockets, and you can also see that the plane doesn't really have any camouflage, and that's because of a Red Army doctrine that vehicles were usually not painted, and that you might have noticed already when I was talking about the vehicles. Whereas the Germans had many camouflage schemes, the Soviets just had the vehicles painted green, and that was it. It's also it for the video. We talked about the vehicles of the Soviet Union, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any comments, please post them below. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.